Hi, welcome to African Perspective. My name is Zelda. Today we're talking about Sudan. Sudan is the third largest country in Africa with a population of roughly 50 million people. Now, currently, 60% of Sudan's population lives in poverty, and Sudan is in a crisis. Sudan is undergoing the world's largest displacement. Roughly 14 million people have been displaced, with 2 million people running away from Sudan to its neighboring countries like Chad and Egypt. There is roughly 150,000 people already been killed during this civil conflict. Now, Sudan is not a stranger to conflicts because it has had two civil conflicts since it got its quote unquote independence, and still years later, this was 1956, but years later, we're still talking about peace in Sudan. It is a country that is rich in resources. It has oil, it has gold, it has uranium, but its GDP per capita is roughly $2,000, and people are dying. There is cholera outbreaks, there is diseases, there is famine. Lots and lots of people being affected by this. And even though there has been interventions by the UN, by the AU, the people of Sudan are still suffering. And I feel like I'm going to sound very bitter, but I feel like other conflicts are getting not too much, but other conflicts are getting spotlighted and not enough people talking about Sudan while it's experiencing the worst displacement globally. So I'm going to talk about it. And if that sounds interesting to you and you want to stick along, feel free to share, feel free to subscribe and to listen in. So on April 15, 2023, there was fighting that erupted between the Sudanese Armed Forces, known as SAF, and the Rapid Support Forces, known as RSF. So the Sudanese Armed Forces are like the official army for the Sudan, and then the RSF are a paramilitary group. And the paramilitary group is essentially a group that operates like a military organization, but isn't like the official army group of the country. And this happened because they have been fighting for control. It's mainly like a power conflict instead of like a land conflict compared to other places in the world. So they're fighting for power about who's going to be in control of Sudan. And the reason they're fighting for power is because they did used to have a leader, but in 2019, a guy named Omar al-Bashir was ousted, and he had been leading Sudan since 1989. So for a very, very long time, they had this one leader. And after he was ousted, there was hopes that, okay, somebody is actually going to come into power. It's going to be a democratic government, but that still hasn't happened. And I'm just trying to look at my data here. The results of this conflict, because since 2019 to 2023, nothing really happened of significant improvement towards democracy. And since 2023, when this fighting began, like I briefly mentioned in the introduction, 150,000 people are dead, 14 million people have been displaced, 17.7 million people are facing hunger, and 4.9 million people are on the brink of famine. Famine is essentially extremely intense food scarcity, which means you could essentially go for over one day without food. It's not like you have the money for food, but you just are not going to spend it on food, or you're dieting. No, it's like you've tried everything in your power, but there's just no food to go around. And 5 million people going through this is a very serious issue that needs to be addressed, because that is 5 million people. That's an entire country. It's more than, I'm thinking of like a city like Dubai, for example. It's bigger than the entire population of a city like Dubai. So imagine all the people in such a big metropolitan city going hungry. This is what the people in Sudan are facing. They have no access to clean water. There's been a cholera outbreak. And some of you are wondering, what even is cholera? Cholera is a waterborne disease it's waterborne, so it's transmitted through drinking dirty water and also having food that is already contaminated with the germ itself. But usually it's through dirty water. And you can think about this, that if you look at the way the conflict is happening in Sudan, both the RSF and the SAF are blocking aid, which means that even if the United Nations and the African Union are sending people to send supplies, for example, I know, for example, in Tanzania, there was a time when I was a little kid. I remember there used to be these little packets that we were given to put into our water, and then you leave the water for some time, and then you can drink it then after the little packet has done some cleaning or whatever it's supposed to do. So that is something that essentially could be given to the people who are in the worst of situations in Sudan, but that has still not happened because their aid has been blocked. And there is not only the famine that they're not having food, but when they do have the food, it's contaminated. When they do get the water, it's unclean. And 16 million children have been affected by this conflict. We're talking about 2 million people who have been displaced to countries like Chad, to countries like Egypt. And to me, it's just so sad because I'm very passionate about children's well-being, and every time when I look at any sort of a conflict or any issue that is happening in an African country, it always goes back to the children, because this is the beginning of their life. And we're not even talking about them having access to education. That is a whole nother conversation. They cannot get access to education if there's fighting in their country. They cannot get access to clean water, like I said, because there's fighting in their country. Their mental health is definitely going to be affected. Their brains are going to develop differently. Their emotional and social well-being is going to be affected as well. How they regulate their emotions is going to be different. So I'm very hurt just to read this kind of statistics, and this is the largest displacement in the world right now, and nobody is talking about it. And I just wonder, because I'm reading here again, like 8.6 million people have been displaced internally, which means they have been displaced from their homes, so where they were locally placed, to another place within the country. So they're still in Sudan, but they have been displaced from their homes. And then there is roughly 2 million people, like I said initially, that have fled the country, that have fled.
Wow, English is my second language.
They have fled the country. And currently, if you look at the entire country, there's a population of 50 million, like I said in the beginning, but 30 million people are in need of aid. And they just have no way of getting it. They have no way of getting it. 30 million people, that is, I keep going back to Tanzania because it's my home country, but that is half of Tanzania. I cannot imagine if half of Tanzania needed this kind of aid. Like half of Tanzania was very, very close to extreme hunger and famine. That is very heartbreaking. And so there are things that have been done. So there are organizations that are at the forefront working on this. The UN, of course. I want to look into the UN, to be frank, and if you're interested in me doing that, please let me know. But the UN have been trying their level best to get aid, but again, it's not going through because both groups, the RSF and the SAF, are blocking the aid. They have also tried mediation, but both sides have said no. The African Union as well has tried quite a lot. So that's the AU. It's like the EU version of Africa. No, it's the African version of the EU. And they have both tried to get the two sides to mediate, because there was a time when there was considerations of integrating the RSF into the Sudanese Armed Forces, but they just said no. They're both fighting for power and control over Sudan. And Sudan is such a wealthy country as well. Like they have so many resources, and in my mind I'm just like, it keeps going back to this. I mean, I did a video recently about the DRC, and I was just complaining about how poor the DRC is compared to the amount of resources that they have. And in the DRC, there are rebels, the M23 rebels and all of that, and there's issues in the mining industry, yes. But the Sudanese case here is very different, because it is their own people fighting against each other. And to me, if it was the RSF and the SAF just fighting against each other and them getting harmed, it's not like I wouldn't care, but I think I would focus on something else. But the fact that there are people who are civilians who are being killed, and civilians are being harmed in the process, and the country's economy is just taking a dip because there are currently so many sanctions, that is another thing that has been done to see if they can push towards a mediation. But the sanctions aren't working. And a sanction essentially is when other countries decide that they're not going to export stuff from you. They're not going to do trade with you as a country because there's something wrong that is happening in your country, basically. And until you fix your behavior, they're not going to do any trade with you. So they have tried that with Sudan, but the RSF and the SAF still just don't care. So there are people struggling, and beyond the fact that people are dying, even the people that are fleeing who get to keep their lives, yes, there is a very heavy humanitarian burden that is happening with the countries around it, like the Egypt and the Chad, and Egypt and Chad and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's a huge humanitarian burden on them, because you are required, and even if you weren't required, it's a good thing to take in refugees from other countries, but still there is that burden that these other countries feel. And a country like Chad is struggling already with its economy, so sending 2 million people to a country like that, they're not going to be able to help much, other than being like, well, I guess there's some peaceful places in our country you can stay at, but that's pretty much all they're going to do. But there's still going to be hunger, there's still going to be cholera outbreaks, because in refugee camps the food and the water is still likely to be very dirty, because a lot of African countries don't have the facilities to care for refugees. The best we can do is just accept you, but they're still just as poor. So it's very sad. Beyond the mediation, something else that has been done is, I mentioned the sanctions as well, but I'm I'm thinking about Gaza and Israel, for example, and what is going on in there. And I think there's been a lot of conversation around that topic. And to me, I'm just like, why is nobody calling for a ceasefire in Sudan? At least I haven't heard of that. And I think there should be more voices on this news as well. The best I can do is just bring it to y'all and be like, this is what I found. But I think there should be conversations about a potential ceasefire because the people of Sudan also need to be heard. They deserve peace as well. And it's just, again, it's very sad that nobody's talking about this. And I don't know, I guess pray for them. That is honestly the best that we can do right now because people are just not talking about it. So unfortunately, a lot of my videos end this way, but I think immediate ceasefire would be a way to start, just cease the fighting for some moment, at least to get the aid in. And then the other thing is creating like a safe aid corridor, which are like pathways for the UN or the AU or other organizations to be able to send aid into the country, because I really don't get why the two groups are not letting aid in, because people need food, people need to eat. You can fight for power all you want, sure, but let your people eat, which is just it goes to show that none of these groups should be in power, because they're fighting, yes, but they're also killing their own people, and they're not caring at all for about what is happening to their own people. And in the long term, of course, something needs to be done for there to be a government in Sudan, because currently they don't really have like a stable, they don't have like a very stable government, and their people are still struggling. And I think I wouldn't know what recommendation to give though, which is, again, I'm just passionate about these topics, which is why I'm talking about them, but I'm not knowledgeable enough about international relations and peacemaking. But I think something needs to be done. And in one of the other videos that I did, the one about Congo, somebody said in the comments that the well-being of Congo is the responsibility of the Congolese. True. So in this case as well, the well-being of the Sudanese is in the hands of the Sudanese. However, I do think that by being neighbors to Sudan, we do have some sort of responsibility, because currently there is 20 to 30 active conflicts going on in Africa, and the largest one happens to be in Sudan, yes. But I think by solving conflicts not for our neighbors, but with our neighbors, it helps bring a more holistic image for the continent, and it helps bring more peace to the continent. Like I said, people being displaced in Sudan does not only affect Sudan, it affects its neighboring countries as well. And so we need to intervene in some sense. We can't just be like,
Well, that's not our business.
so those are my recommendations. It's a very short video, but again, the people of Sudan deserve peace, and I'll pray for them, and I hope that the fighting ends soon. It's been 2 years. A lot of lives have been lost, and those are the only ones that have been recorded. There's still more people whose stories we'll never get to know. People who came and left very quickly, and we're never going to get to know who they were, just because two greedy groups of people decided to fight. So I hope this is a useful video just for you to know what's going on in Sudan, and again, pray for the people of Sudan. And that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to share, subscribe, and like. Bye.